Welcome, everyone, to the Saturday reading stream, the first reading stream of the new year. So, on Thursday, I finally finished my playthrough of Freedom Planet with the end of Miller's story, which diverged a bit from the other two stories. Tonight, I will be finishing off Abram Leon's The Jewish Question, a Marxist Interpretation. I reckon I am going to turn off the virtual background today because after I have finished reading this book, I will be speaking for a bit on basically a related topic, basically the preliminary core for basically an analysis of contemporary geopolitics through a Marxist lens that relates explicitly to the Zionist problem, as I call it, and how religious eschatology, specifically that of the three major Abrahamic faiths, has basically tied into contemporary geopolitics in very dangerous ways. So, but with that, I will just get straight into it. So we finish off with the spiciest part. Chapter 7, The Decay of Capitalism and the Tragedy of the Jews in the 20th Century. Let's begin. The primary merit of the capitalist regime lay in its tremendous expansion of the productive forces, its creation of a world economy, its permitting an unprecedented development of technology and science. As against the stagnation of the feudal world, capitalism presented an unparalleled dynamism. Hundreds of millions of people, immobilized up to then in a routinized, horizonless existence, suddenly found themselves drawn into the current of a feverish and intense life. The Jews lived within the pores of feudal society. When the feudal structure started to crumble, it began expelling elements that were, at one and the same time, foreign to it and indispensable to it. Even before the peasant had left the village for the industrial centre, the Jew had abandoned the small medieval town in order to emigrate to the great cities of the world. The destruction of the age-old function of Jews within feudal society is accompanied by their passive penetration into capitalist society. But if capitalism has given humanity certain tremendous conquests, only its disappearance can allow humanity to enjoy them. Only socialism will be able to lift humanity to the level of the material bases of civilization. But capitalism survives, and all the enormous acquisitions turn more and more against the most elementary interests of humanity. The progress of technology and science has become the progress of the technology and science of death. The development of the means of production is nothing but the growth of the means of destruction. So relevant. The world become too small for the productive apparatus built up by capitalism, is constricted even further by the desperate efforts of each imperialism to extend its sphere of influence. While unbridled export constitutes an inseparable phenomenon of the capitalist mode of production, decaying capitalism tries to get along without it. That is to say, it adds to its disorders the disorder of its own suppression. Powerful barriers impede the free circulation of commodities and men. Insurmountable obstacles arise before the masses, deprived of work and bread following the breakdown of the traditional feudal world. The decay of capitalism has not only accelerated the decomposition of feudal society, but has multiplied hundredfold the sufferings that resulted from it. The civilizers, in a blind alley, bar the road to those who wish to become civilized. Unable to attain civilization, the latter are still less able to remain in the stage of barbarism. To the peoples whose traditional bases of existence it has destroyed, capitalism bars the road to the future after having closed the road of the past. It is with these general phenomena that the Jewish tragedy of the 20th century is tied up. The highly tragic situation of Jews in our epoch is explained by the extreme precariousness of their social and economic position. The first to be eliminated by decaying feudalism, the Jews were also the first to be rejected by the convulsions of dying capitalism. The Jewish masses find themselves wedged between the anvil of decaying feudalism and the hammer of rotting capitalism. A. The Jews in Eastern Europe. The entire situation of Judaism in Eastern Europe is explained by the combination of the decline of the old feudal forms and of the degeneration of capitalism. The social differentiation that took place in the village as a result of capitalist penetration brought about an influx into the cities of enriched as well as proletarianized peasants. The former wanted to invest their capital, the latter to offer their labor. But the openings for the placement of capital were as slight as those for work. Barely having been born, the capitalist system already showed all the symptoms of senility. The general decay of capitalism manifested itself in crises and unemployment within the countries of Eastern Europe. By the closing of all the outlets for emigration outside their frontiers, 7 to 8 million peasants were landless and almost without work in independent Poland. Caught between two fires, the Jews were exposed to the hostility of the petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry, both seeking to find a place for themselves at the expense of the Jews. Jewish positions are particularly threatened by the urban Polish bourgeoisie and by the rich peasants who seek a solution for their difficulties through a fierce economic nationalism, whereas the Polish working class, suffering from permanent unemployment, seeks a remedy for its poverty through social liberation and puts its reliance upon economic and political solidarity rather than upon a sterile and murderous competition. It is precisely in the regions that capitalism had most developed that a non-Jewish commercial class formed most rapidly. It is there that the anti-Semitic struggle was fiercest. The decrease in the number of Jewish shops has been greatest in the central provinces, that is to say, in a region where the population is purely Polish. where the peasants have attained a higher standard of living, where industry is more developed, which is very important for the material and intellectual situation of the village. Whereas in 1914, 72% of the stores in the villages were Jewish, this fell to 34% in 1935. That is to say, by more than half. The situation was better for the Jews in territories less developed economically. The participation of Jews in commerce is more important in the most backward provinces, maintains Lipovsky. The eastern sections belonging to White Russians are, in economic, intellectual, and political terms, the most backward part of Poland. In these regions, the absolute majority of Jewish businessmen has increased by a third. In 1938, 82.6% of the shops in the backward regions of Poland were in the hands of Jews. All of these facts are further proof that the destruction of feudalism is at the bottom of the Jewish question in Eastern Europe. The more backward a region is, the more easily are the Jews able to preserve their traditional positions. But it is the general decay of capitalism that renders the Jewish question impossible to resolve. The crisis and chronic unemployment make it impossible for the Jews to go into other occupations, producing a frightful crowding in the occupations they follow, and unceasingly augmenting anti-Semitic violence. The governments of the provincial nobles and large capitalists naturally endeavored to organize the anti-Jewish current and thereby divert the masses from their real enemy. Resolve the Jewish question became for them a synonym for the solution of the social question. In order to make place for the national forces, the state organized a systematic struggle to de-Judify all occupations. The methods of Polonizing business in Poland proceeded from simple boycotting of Jewish stores by means of propaganda, right up to pogroms and arson. Here, by way of example, is a victory bulletin published June 14, 1936, in the government newspaper Ilustrowany Kurie Codzienny. 160 Polish business positions were taken during the first months of this year in the Madam district. In Purzk alone, a notorious pogrom city, 50 business licenses were purchased by Poles. All in all, 2,500 Polish business positions were taken over in the various districts. Jewish artisans were no longer tenderly handled by the Polish governments. Boycott, exorbitant taxes, Polish examinations. Thousands of Jewish craftsmen did not know this language, contributed to pushing out the Jewish artisans. Deprived of unemployment relief, the craft proletariat is one of the most disinherited. The wages of Jewish workers were very low and their living conditions frightful, workday up to 18 hours. The universities were the terrain of choice for the struggle against the Jews. The Polish bourgeoisie exerted all its efforts to prevent Jews from entering the intellectual professions. The Polish universities became places of veritable pogroms, throwing people out of windows, etc. Well before Hitler's Stars of David, the Polish bourgeoisie introduced ghetto benches in the university classrooms, where Jewish students were required to sit. Legal measures, more circumspect but no less effective, rendered entry into the universities almost impossible for the Jewish youth, whose ancestral heritage had strongly developed their intellectual faculties. The percentage of Jewish students in Poland declined from 24.5% in 1923 to 33 to 13.2% in 1933 to 36. The same policy of excluding Jewish students was followed in Lithuania and Hungary. The percentage of Jewish students in Latvia declined from 15.7% in 1920 to 8.5% in 1931. In Hungary, from 31.7% in 1918 to 10.5% in 1931. In general, the situation of the Jews in Hungary had for centuries resembled in every way that of Poland. In Hungary, a country of great feudal magnates, the Jews for a long time played the role of an intermediary class between the lords and the peasants. One of our correspondents reminds us that at the end of the 19th century, a certain Count de Palogier had great trouble in avoiding expulsion from the National Club of the Hungarian nobility in Budapest, simply because he wanted to take charge personally of the industrial processing of the agricultural products from his land, particularly the distillation of alcohol from potatoes and of brandy. He had even gone so far as to take charge of their sale. The liberal professions were likewise not unaffected by this prejudice, which was as widespread among the high aristocracy as among the petty nobility. Shortly before the fall of the dual monarchy in Austria-Hungary, a Hungarian magnate expressed his disgust for noblemen who, for money, examined the throats of individuals whom they didn't know. A natural consequence of this attitude was that the Jews formed the intermediary class between the peasantry and the nobility, particularly in the towns. Trade, and especially petty trade, was a Jewish matter in the eyes of the people. Even today, in the minds of the masses of the Magyar population, the small shop, and in a general way, everything connected with the running of the shop, are thought of as Jewish. Even if this shop has become an instrument of economic struggle against the Jews. Here is a story that strikingly illustrates this state of mind. A peasant woman sent her son on some shopping errands. She wanted them taken care of at the semi-statized Hanya cooperative and not at a Jewish shop. So she said to him, Pista, go to the Jew, not to the Jew who is a Jew, but to the new shop. Okay. The process of elimination of the Jews from their economic positions took place in all of Eastern Europe. The situation of the Jewish masses became hopeless. A declassed youth, having no possibility of integrating itself into economic life, lived in black despair. Prior to the Second World War, 40% of the Jewish population of Poland had to resort to charitable institutions. Tuberculosis raged. Let us give the floor to correspondents of the Economic and Statistical section of the Jewish Scientific Institute, residing in regions where despair and the complete absence of a better future were stifling the Jewish youth. Here is what one wrote of Miedzerse, province of Volhynia. The situation of the Jewish youth is very difficult, notably that of the sons and daughters of tradesmen who are without work because their parents do not require assistance. It is impossible to open new businesses. 75 boys and 120 young girls, aged 15 to 28, have no hope whatever of integrating themselves into the economic life of the country. Of Suljo, province of Lodz, we are in possession of a more detailed picture, which is characteristic of the small towns of Poland. Almost 50% of the children of Jewish business people work with their parents. I think we're right now. Let me just double check that real quick. Yeah. Almost 50% of the children of Jewish business people work with their parents, but solely because they are unable to find another job. 25% are learning some sort of trade, and 25% are completely idle. 70% of the children of artisans remain in the workshops of their parents, even though the latter are almost without work and can very well get along without assistance. 10% are learning new trades. 20% have nothing to do. The sons of rabbis and of employees of Jewish communities are trying to attain a livelihood by learning a trade. All young people want to emigrate, 90% to Palestine, but because of the limited number of emigration visas, their chances are slim. And yet they are ready to go to the North Pole or the South Pole, just so long as they can tear themselves out of this stagnation. More and more, the youth is turning toward the crafts, and the number of young people in business is on the decline. Mm. Not sponsored. B. The Jews in Western Europe. The condition of Jews, rendered hopeless in Eastern Europe by the combined decay of feudalism and capitalism, which created a stifling atmosphere and fierce antagonisms, had worldwide repercussions. Western and Central Europe became the theatre of a frightful rise of anti Semitism. The reduction in Jewish emigration, whose average annual rate declined from 155,000 in the period 1901 to 1914 to 43,657 in the years 1926 to 1935, greatly aggravated the situation of the Jews in Eastern Europe. But the general crisis of capitalism made even this reduced emigration an intolerable burden to the Western countries. The Jewish question reached unprecedented sharpness, not only in the countries of so I just had another bit of a blackout then. At least that one was only brief. Yep. So the Jewish question reached unprecedented sharpness not only in the countries of emigration, but in the countries of immigration as well. Even before the First Imperialist War, the mass arrival of Jewish immigrants created a strong anti-Semitic movement among the middle classes of several Central and Western European countries. We need only recall the great successes of the anti-Semitic Social Christian Party in Vienna and of its leader, Karl Lueger, the sweeping rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, Heinrich von Treitschke, and the Dreyfus Affair. Anti-Semitism showed its roots most clearly in Vienna, one of the great centers of Jewish immigration before the First Imperialist War. The petty bourgeoisie, ruined by the development of monopoly capitalism and headed for proletarianization, was exasperated by the mass arrival of the Jewish element, traditionally petty bourgeois and artisan. After the First Imperialist War, the countries of Western and Central Europe, Germany, Austria, France, and Belgium, saw tens of thousands of Jewish immigrants in tatters, lacking all resources, pour in from Eastern Europe. The seeming post-war prosperity permitted these elements to penetrate into all branches of business and artisanry. But even the Jewish immigrants who had penetrated into the factories did not remain there for long. The long commercial past of the Jews weighed heavily on their descendants, and the favorable post-war economic conditions brought about a perceptible process of deproletarianization in Western Europe as well as in the United States. The Jewish workers retained their artisan position in the countries of immigration. In Paris, in 1936, out of 21,083 Jewish workers belonging to trade unions, 9,253 worked at home. The economic catastrophe of 1929 threw the petty bourgeois masses into a hopeless situation. The overcrowding in small business, artisanry, and the intellectual professions took on unheard of proportions. The petty bourgeois regarded his Jewish competitor with growing hostility, since the latter's professional skills, the result of centuries of practice, often enabled him to survive hard times more easily. Anti-Semitism even gained the ear of wide layers of work artisans, who traditionally had been under petty bourgeois influence. It is consequently incorrect to accuse big business of having brought about anti-Semitism. Big business only proceeded to make use of the elementary anti-Semitism of the petty bourgeois masses. It fashioned it into a major component of fascist ideology. By the myth of Jewish capitalism, big business endeavored to take advantage of the anti-capitalist hatred of the masses for its own gain. The real possibility of agitation against Jewish capitalists lay in the antagonism between monopoly capital and speculative commercial capital, which is what Jewish capital was in the main. Scandals in speculative commercial capital are generally more widely known to the public, especially stock market scandals. This allows monopoly capital to channel the hatred of the petty bourgeois masses and even of a part of the workers against Jewish capitalism. Mass immigration of Jews. Deja vu? Deja vu? Anti-Semitism triggered by mass immigration of Jews. Islamophobia triggered by mass immigration of Muslims. Both being the result of issues that the capitalist system created and the capitalist class playing on the hatred to try and steer it in a direction favorable to them. Interesting. Oh, that's, yeah. Wow. That's crazy. Funny how that works. C. Racism, of course. Ideology is a process which is, it is true, carried on consciously by what we call a thinker, but with a consciousness that is spurious. The actual motives by which he is impelled remain hidden from him, for otherwise it would not be an ideological process. Hence, the motives he supposes himself to have are either spurious or illusory. Up to now, we have tried to understand the real foundations of anti Semitism in our time. But it is sufficient to consider the role played in the development of anti Semitism by the wretched document fabricated by the Tsarist Okhrana, secret political police, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, to become aware of the importance of the spurious or illusory motives of anti Semitism. In Hitlerite propaganda today, the real motivation of anti Semitism in Western Europe, the economic competition of the petty bourgeoisie, no longer plays any role. On the contrary, the most fantastic allegations of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the plans for universal domination by international Jewry, reappear in every speech and manifesto of Hitler. We must therefore analyze this mythical ideological element of anti Semitism. Religion is the most characteristic example of an ideology. I can't wait to get to the end. Its true motive forces must be sought in the very prosaic domain of the material interests of a class. But it is in the most ethereal spheres that its apparent motive forces are found. Nevertheless, the God who launched the Puritan fanatics of Oliver Cromwell against the English aristocracy and Charles I was nothing but the reflection or symbol of the interests of the English peasantry and bourgeoisie. Every religious revolution is in reality a social revolution. It is the unbridled development of productive forces colliding against the narrow limits of consumption that constitutes the true motive force of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. but it is race that seems to be its most characteristic force. Racism is therefore, in the first place, the ideological disguise of modern imperialism. The race struggling for its Lebensraum, its living space, is nothing but the reflection of the permanent necessity for expansion that characterizes finance or monopoly capitalism. While the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, the contradiction between production and consumption, involves, for the big bourgeoisie, the necessity to struggle for the conquest of foreign markets. That same contradiction compels the petty bourgeoisie to struggle for the expansion of the domestic market. The lack of foreign markets for the big capitalists proceeds hand in hand with the lack of domestic markets for the small capitalists. Whereas the big bourgeoisie struggles furiously against its competitors on the foreign market, the petty bourgeoisie combats its competitors on the domestic market, not a whit less fiercely. Racism abroad is consequently accompanied by racism at home. The unprecedented aggravation of capitalist contradictions in the 20th century brings with it a growing exacerbation of racism abroad as well as racism at home. The primarily commercial and artisan character of Jews, heritage of a long historical past, makes them enemy number one of the petty bourgeoisie on the domestic market. It is therefore the petty bourgeois character of Judaism that makes it so odious to the petty bourgeoisie. But while the historical past of Jews exercises a determining influence on their present social composition, it has effects that are no less important on the representation of Jews in the consciousness of the popular masses. For the latter, the Jew remains the traditional representative of the money power. This fact is of great importance because the petty bourgeoisie is not only a capitalist class, that is to say, a repository in miniature of all capitalist tendencies, it is also anti-capitalist. It has a strong, though vague, consciousness of being ruined and despoiled by big business. But its hybrid character, its position between classes, does not permit it to understand the true structure of society, nor the real character of big business. It is incapable of understanding the true tendencies of social evolution, for it has a presentiment that this evolution cannot help but be fatal for it. It wants to be anti-capitalist without ceasing to be capitalist. It wants to destroy the bad character of capitalism, that is to say, the tendencies that are ruining it, while preserving the good character of capitalism that permits it to live and get rich. But since there does not exist a capitalism that has the good tendencies without also possessing the bad, the petty bourgeoisie is forced to dream it up. It is no accident that the petty bourgeoisie has invented supercapitalism, the bad deviation of capitalism, its evil spirit. It is no accident that its theoreticians have struggled mightily for over a century, Proudhon, against bad speculative capitalism and defended useful productive capitalism. The attempt of Nazi theoreticians to distinguish between national productive capital and Jewish parasitic capital is probably the most recent attempt of this kind. And this is the exact same thing that people do today. If you ever hear anyone try to distinguish between, competitive capitalism or like crony capitalism or between capitalism and globalism. This is exactly what globalism is. It is decoupling the bad imperialism from the good productive capitalism. This is precisely, I have explained this to people before. This entire concept of globalism is just trying to decouple the notion of imperialism as the bad from the good elements of capitalism, like competition and things like that. That's not how this works. And this is, of course, a petty bourgeois tendency. But it is not necessarily, in a country like Australia, for instance, although it exists to some extent in other countries as well. In a country like Australia with a very high rate of asset ownership through home ownership or superannuation as a kind of capital for workers or capital for retirement. This is the essence of embourgeoisement. It gives a large portion of the working class a dual identity that instills in them petty bourgeois ideology. That is why in a developed country like Australia with very high home ownership, this is why this, at the very least, quasi-fascist, if not fully fascist ideology is seeping in so deep to, older people who have homes and stuff like that, because it is this same petty bourgeois tendency to try and decouple the bad from the good, the globalism from capitalist imperialism. It is globalism is the result of capitalism. And this is something that is being, essentially revisited here, but is also very much the essence of this. Both of what these books are going through is essentially a very, they're essentially explaining the exact same thing. Globalism is not a thing. Or globalism is just trying to decouple the imperialism from the capitalism. You cannot do that. That does not work. You cannot destroy one without destroying the other. But let's continue. Jewish capitalism can best represent the myth of bad capitalism. The concept of Jewish wealth is, in turn, solidly entrenched in the consciousness of the popular masses. It is solely a question of reawakening and making concrete, by means of well-orchestrated propaganda, the image of the usurious Jew, against whom peasant, petty bourgeois, and lord had struggled over a long period. The petty bourgeoisie and a layer of workers remaining under its sway are easily influenced by such propaganda and fall into this trap of Jewish capitalism. Historically, the success of racism means that capitalism has managed to channel the anti-capitalist consciousness of the masses toward a form that predates capitalism and that no longer exists except in a vestigial state. This vestige is nevertheless still sufficiently great to give a certain appearance of reality to the myth. We see that racism is made up of rather strange elements. It reflects the expansionist will of big capital. It expresses the hatred of the petty bourgeoisie for foreign elements within the domestic market, as well as its anti-capitalist tendencies. It is in its aspect as a capitalist element that the petty bourgeoisie fights its Jewish competitor, and in its anti-capitalist aspect that it struggles against Jewish capital. Racism finally diverts the anti-capitalist struggle of the masses into a form that predates capitalism, persisting only in a vestigial state. But while scientific analysis permits us to reveal its component parts, racist ideology must appear to be an absolutely homogeneous doctrine. Racism serves precisely to cast all classes into the crucible of a racial community opposed to other races. The racist myth strives to appear as a whole, having only vague connections with its origins, which are often very different. It endeavors to fuse its different elements together in perfect fashion. Thus, for example, racism against the foreign enemy, the ideological disguise of imperialism, is not compelled, in and of itself, to adopt an anti-Semitic coloration. Given the need to muddle everything together, it generally does take on this character. The anti-capitalism of the masses, first channeled in the direction of Judaism, is then carried over against the foreigners, which is identified with the Jews. To any right-wingers who watch this, please just maybe be a little self-aware as I read this. Try to just like self-reflect a little bit. If you have fallen for this shit, you don't necessarily need it's not too late to get out of it. Like this shit, it is the exact same thing. It's the exact same thing when people talk about immigrants today. Look, you cannot like mass immigration, sure. Don't take it out on the immigrants. That's the biggest thing. Do not take it out on the immigrants. Unite with the immigrants. Most of them would want to return home. Do you think most of the immigrants coming from third world countries want to be here? Like a lot of people who will carry on about the notion that people have, an intrinsic connection to their nation, and that's like a justification for nationalist ideology, then seem to see people coming in from other nations as like barbarians at the gates who somehow don't have a connection to their own nation. They do. But in many cases, these days especially, that connection is being uprooted by constant imperialist wars. By Israel in the Middle East. Prime example. By constant wars being waged in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. Not so much in Latin America, although it's probably about to get worse. But some civil wars in Africa and stuff like that, and especially like the conflict in the Middle East, which will not stop until Israel's destroyed. It will not stop until Israel's destroyed. So, you know, some self-reflection is important. And this should not be taken as an insult. It should be taken as an invitation. Reflect, understand, and act accordingly. It is deception that is being capitalized on. That is a big thing at play here. It is being capitalized on. It is being manipulated. Hatred being manipulated into these quasi-fascist or even fully fascist ideologies. That is what it is. It is the same thing that happened back then, in essence. Uh, The Germanic race will find itself faced with the duty of fighting the Jew, its principal enemy, in all his disguises. That of domestic Bolshevism and liberalism, the Anglo-Saxon plutocracy, and of foreign Bolshevism. Hitler states in Mein Kampf that it is indispensable to present the various enemies under a common aspect. Otherwise, there is a danger that the masses will start thinking too much about the differences that exist among those enemies. That is why racism is a myth and not a doctrine. It demands faith and fears reason like the plague. Anti-Semitism contributes most to cementing the different elements of racism. Just as it is necessary to cast the different classes into one single race, so is it also necessary that this race have only a single enemy, the international Jew. The myth of race is necessarily accompanied by its negative, the anti-race, the Jew. The racial community is built on hatred of the Jews, a hatred of which the most solid racial foundation is buried in history in a period when the Jew was, in effect, a foreign body and hostile to all classes. The irony of history wills that the most radical anti-Semitic ideology in all history should triumph precisely in the period when the Jewish people are on the road of economic and social assimilation. But like all ironies of history, this seeming paradox is very understandable. At the time when the Jew was unassimilable, at a time when he really represented capital, he was indispensable to society. There could be no question of destroying him. At the present time, capitalist society, on the edge of the abyss, tries to save itself by resurrecting the Jew and the hatred of the Jews. But it is precisely because the Jews do not play the role attributed to them that anti-Semitic persecution can become so extensive. Jewish capitalism is a myth. That is why it is so easily vanquished. But in vanquishing its negative, racism at the same time destroys the foundations for its own existence. To the degree that the phantom of Jewish capitalism disappears, capitalist reality appears in all its ugliness. The social contradictions, banished for a moment by the fumes of racial intoxication, reappear in all their sharpness. In the long run, the myth proves powerless against reality. Despite its apparent homogeneity, the very evolution of racism lays bare the economic, social, and political transformations that it strives to conceal. At the beginning, in order to arm itself for imperialist war, for its living space, big business must beat down its domestic enemy, the proletariat. It is the petty bourgeoisie and declassed proletarian elements that furnish it with its shock troops, capable of smashing the economic and political organizations of the proletariat. Racism, at the beginning, appears therefore as an ideology of the petty bourgeoisie. Its program reflects the interests and illusions of this class. It promises struggle against super capitalism, against the trusts, stock exchange, big department stores, etc. But as soon as big business has succeeded in smashing the proletariat, thanks to the support of the petty bourgeoisie, the latter becomes an unbearable burden to it. The program of preparation for war implies precisely the ruthless elimination of small business, a prodigious development of the trusts, and extensive proletarianization. This same military preparation necessitates the support, or at least a kind of neutrality from the proletariat, the most important factor in production. Thus, big business does not hesitate for a moment to violate its most solemn promises in the most cynical way and to strangle the petty bourgeoisie in the most brutal fashion. Racism now devotes itself to flattering the proletariat, to appearing as a radically socialist movement. It is here that the identification of Jews with capitalism plays its most important role. The radical expropriation of Jewish capitalists has to fulfill the role of collateral, of endorser of racism's anti-capitalist will to struggle. The anonymous character of the capitalism of monopolies, in contrast to the generally personal and often speculative commercial character of Jewish businesses, facilitates this operation of spiritual swindling. The common man more readily sees the real capitalist, the businessman, the manufacturer, the speculator, than the respectable director of a corporation who is made to pass as an indispensable factor in production. It is in this way that racist ideology reaches the following identifications. Judaism equals capitalism, racism equals socialism, and a regulated war economy equals a planned socialist economy. It is undeniable that large layers of workers, deprived of their organizations, blinded by the foreign political successes of Hitler, have allowed themselves to be taken in by racist mythology, just as was the case previously with the petty bourgeoisie. For the time being, the bourgeoisie appears to have attained its objective. The furious anti-Jewish persecution extending throughout Europe serves to indicate the definitive victory of racism, the final defeat of international Judaism. This is very, very annoying. B. The Jewish race. The racial theory and Nazi Nuremberg race laws, now dominant, is nothing but an attempt to establish racism on a scientific basis. It is devoid of any scientific value. It is enough to observe the pitiful acrobatics the racist theoreticians perform to demonstrate the relationship of the Germans and the Nipponese, or the irrevocable antagonism between the heroic German spirit and the commercial Anglo-Saxon spirit, in order to be completely convinced of this. The ramblings of A. Georges Montandon on deprostituting the Jewish ethnic identity by compelling the Jews to wear Stars of David are certainly no better. The real prostitution of certain scholars to racism presents an unusual spectacle of the decline of human dignity. But we see there only an end product of the complete decay of bourgeois science, which already, under democracy, was by no means objective. Racist stupidites must not, however, deter us from examining the extent to which it is necessary to speak of a Jewish race. The most superficial examination of the question leads us to the conclusion that the Jews are in reality a mixture of the most diverse races. It is evidently the diaspora character of Jews that is the fundamental cause of this fact. But even in Palestine, the Jews were far from constituting a pure race. Leaving aside the fact that, according to the Bible, the Israelites brought a mass of Egyptians with them when they left Egypt, and that Strabo considered them as descendants of Egyptians, it is enough to recall the numerous races that had established themselves in Palestine: Hittites, Canaanites, Philistines, Aryans, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Greeks, Arabs. According to Strabo, Judea was inhabited by Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Arabs. The development of Jewish proselytism during the Greek and Roman era strongly accentuated the mixed character of Judaism. As early as 139 BC, the Jews were driven out of Rome for having won converts there. The community of Antioch was composed in large part of converts. Proselytism continued even during subsequent eras. The compulsory conversion of slaves to Judaism, as well as the conversion of the Khazars and other races and tribes during the long diaspora, are among the many factors that have made Judaism a conglomeration of racial characteristics. There is absolutely no racial homogeneity today between the Yemenite Jews, for example, and the Jews of Dagestan in the Caucasus. The first are Middle Eastern in type, while the second belong to the Mongol race. There are black Jews in India, Ethiopian Jews, Falasha, troglodyte, cave-dwelling Jews in Africa. However, this fundamental difference that exists, for example, between the Jews of Dagestan and the Yemenite Jews, does not exhaust the question. In reality, 9/10 of today's Jews are inhabitants of Eastern Europe or descendants of Jews from this area. Is there an Eastern European Jewish race? Here is how an anti-Semitic theoretician, Hans Gunther, answers this question. Eastern Judaism, which comprises close to 9/10 of the Jews, consisting today of the Jews of Russia, Poland, Galicia, Hungary, Austria, and Germany, as well as the largest part of the Jews in North America and Western Europe, constitutes a racial mixture that we may designate as Near Eastern, Eastern, Baltic, Asian, Nordic, Hamitic, and Negroid. That's right. Yep. We're dealing with racism, aren't we? According to research undertaken in New York of 4,235 Jews, there were 52.62% of Jews who were what? Brunette? Is that like hair color? So 52.62% of Jews brunette, and 56.94% of Jewesses, so I'm assuming that just means female Jews, 10.42% of blonde Jews, 10.27% of blonde Jewesses, and 36.96% of mixed hair color Jews, 32.79% of mixed haired Jewesses. Dealing with old ideology. Also, 14.25% of Jews and 12.7% of Jewesses had what is called the Jewish nose, which is nothing else but the nose common to the peoples of Asia Minor, especially widespread among the Armenians. This nose is also common among the Mediterranean peoples, as well as among the Bavarians, Dinaric race. These few observations permit us to see how stupid the concept of the Jewish race is. the Jewish race is a myth. On the other hand, it is correct to say that the Jews are a racial mixture that is different from the racial mixtures of most of the European peoples, especially the Slavs and Germans. However, it is not so much the anthropological characteristics of the Jews that distinguish them from other peoples as their physiological, pathological, and above all, psychological characteristics. It is primarily the economic and social function of the Jewish people throughout history that explains this phenomenon. For centuries, Jews were the inhabitants of cities occupied in trade. The Jewish type is far more the result of this historical function than a racial characteristic. The Jews have absorbed a mass of heterogeneous racial elements, but all these elements have been subjected to the influence of the special conditions in which the Jews lived, which, in the long run, ended up with the creation of the so-called Jewish type. This is the result of a long selection, not racial, but economic and social. The physical weakness, the frequency of certain illnesses like diabetes, nervous disorders, a specific body posture, etc., are not racial characteristics, but are the result of a specific social position. I am assuming that this also applies when, like this economic and social shit, I'm assuming that this is what also applies to those who talk about races having IQ differences. I mean, yeah, well, it's talking about race. So this is probably something that should also be considered by those who talk about, IQ with respect to race. I've seen it. I see it still today. It's Nazi shit. Stop it. Nothing is more ridiculous than to explain, for example, the Jews' penchant for trade or their tendency to abstract thinking on the basis of their race. Wherever the Jews are assimilated economically, wherever they cease to form a class, they rapidly lose all these characteristics. There you go. And so it happens that where the racist theoreticians thought they were face to face with a genuine race, they were in reality only viewing a human community whose specific characteristics are above all the result of the social conditions in which it lived for many centuries. A change in these social conditions must naturally bring with it the disappearance of the racial characteristics of Judaism. Mm. E. Zionism. Been waiting for this. Zionism was born in the light of the incendiary fires of the Russian pogroms of 1882 and in the tumult of the Dreyfus Affair. Two events that expressed the sharpness of the Jewish question, the sharpness that the Jewish question began to assume at the end of the 19th century. The rapid capitalist development of the Russian economy after the reform of 1861 made the situation of the Jewish masses in the small towns untenable. In the West, the middle classes, shattered by capitalist concentration, began to turn against the Jewish element whose competition aggravated their situation. In Russia, the Association of the Lovers of Zion was founded. Leo Pinsker wrote Auto-Emancipation, in which he called for a return to Palestine as the sole possible solution of the Jewish question. In Paris, Baron Rothschild, who, like all the Jewish magnates, viewed with very little favour the mass arrival of Jewish immigrants in the Western countries, became invested in Jewish colonization in Palestine. to help their unfortunate brothers to return to the land of their ancestors, that is to say, to go as far away as possible, contained nothing displeasing to the Jewish bourgeoisie of the West, who with reason feared the rise of anti-Semitism. A short while after the publication of Leo Pinska's book, a Jewish journalist in Budapest, Theodor Herzl, saw anti-Semitic demonstrations in Paris sparked by the Dreyfus Affair. Soon he wrote The Jewish State, which to this day remains the Bible of the Zionist movement. From its inception, Zionism appeared as a reaction of the Jewish petty bourgeoisie, which still forms the core of the Jewish population, hit hard by the mounting anti-Semitic wave, kicked from one country to another, and striving to attain the promised land where it might find shelter from the tempests sweeping the modern world. Zionism is thus a very young movement. It is the youngest of the European national movements. That does not prevent it from claiming, even more than all other nationalism, that it draws its substance from a far distant past. Whereas Zionism is, in fact, the product of the last phase of capitalism beginning to decay, it claims to draw its origin from a past more than 2,000 years ago. Whereas Zionism is essentially a reaction against the situation created for Jews by the combination of the destruction of feudalism and the decay of capitalism, it affirms that it constitutes a reaction against the state of things existing since the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Christian era. Its recent birth is, naturally, the best reply to these pretensions. As a matter of fact, how can one believe that the remedy for an evil existing for 2,000 years was discovered only at the end of the 19th century? But like all nationalisms, and even more intensely, Zionism views the historic past in the light of the present. In this way, too, it distorts the present-day picture. Just as France is represented to French children as existing since the Gaul of Vercingetorix, just as the children of Provence in southern France are told that the victories that the kings of Ile-de-France, Paris, won over their ancestors were their own successes. In the same way, Zionism tries to create the myth of an eternal Judaism, eternally the prey of the same persecutions. Zionism sees in the fall of Jerusalem the cause of the dispersion, and consequently the fountainhead of all Jewish misfortunes of the past, present, and future. The source of all the misfortunes of the Jewish people is the loss of its historic country and its dispersion in all countries, declares the Marxist delegation of the Poale Zion to the Dutch Scandinavian Committee. After the violent dispersion of the Jews by the Romans, their tragic history continues. Driven out of their country, the Jews did not wish, oh, beauty of free will, to assimilate. Imbued with their national cohesiveness, with a superior ethical feeling, and with an indestructible belief in a single God, see the article of Ben Adir on anti-Semitism in the General Encyclopedia, they have resisted all attempts at assimilation. Their sole hope during these dark times, which lasted 2,000 years, has been the vision of a return to their ancient country. Zionism has never seriously posed this question. Why, during these 2,000 years, have not the Jews really tried to return to this country? Why was it necessary to wait until the end of the 19th century for Herzl to succeed in convincing them of this necessity? Why were all the predecessors of Herzl, like the famous Sabbatai Zevi, treated as false messiahs? Why were the adherents of Sabbatai Zevi fiercely persecuted by Orthodox Judaism? Naturally, in replying to these interesting questions, refuge is sought behind religion. As long as the masses believed that they had to remain in the diaspora until the advent of the Messiah, they had to suffer in silence, states Chaim Zitlovsky, whose Zionism is moreover quite conditional. Nevertheless, this explanation tells us nothing. What is required is precisely an answer to the question of why the Jewish masses believed that they had to await the Messiah in order to be able to return to their country. Religion, being an ideological reflection of social interests, it must perforce correspond to them. Today, religion does not at all constitute an obstacle to Zionism. In reality, so long as the Jews were incorporated into the feudal system, the dream of Zion was nothing but a dream and did not correspond to any real interest of Jews. The Jewish tavern owner, or the tax farmer of 16th century Poland, thought as little of returning to Palestine as does the Jewish millionaire in America today. Jewish religious messianism was no whit different than from the messianism belonging to other religions. Jewish pilgrims who went to Palestine met Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslim pilgrims. Besides, it was not so much the return to Palestine that constituted the foundation of this messianism as the belief in the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem. All these idealist conceptions of Zionism are naturally inseparable from the dogma of eternal anti-Semitism. As long as the Jews live in the diaspora, they will be hated by the natives. This essential point of view for Zionism, its spinal column, so to speak, is naturally given different nuances by its various currents. So yeah, Zionism is just like victim mentality. I mean that really tends to be what bourgeois nationalism is in any degree. It is in essence um, like a victim mentality. It promotes a victim mentality. Like, oh, my race is oppressed. Zionism projects modern anti-Semitism onto of history. It saves itself the trouble of studying the various forms of anti-Semitism and their evolution. However, we have seen that in different historical periods, Jews made up part of the possessing classes and were treated as such. To summarize this idealist conception, the sources of Zionism must be sought in the impossibility of assimilation because of eternal anti-Semitism and of the will to safeguard the treasures of Judaism. In reality, Zionist ideology, like all ideologies, is only the distorted reflection of the interests of a class. It is the ideology of the Jewish petty bourgeoisie, suffocating between feudalism in ruins and capitalism in decay. The refutation of the ideological fantasies of Zionism does not naturally refute the real needs that brought them into being. It is modern anti-Semitism, and not mythical, eternal anti-Semitism, which is the best agitator in favor of Zionism. Similarly, the basic question to determine is, to what extent is Zionism capable of resolving not the eternal Jewish question, but the Jewish question in the period of capitalist decay? Zionist theoreticians like to compare Zionism with all other national movements. But in reality, the foundations of the national movements and that of Zionism are altogether different. The national movement of the European bourgeoisie is the consequence of capitalist development. It reflects the will of the bourgeoisie to create the national basis for production, to abolish feudal remnants. The national movement of the European bourgeoisie is closely linked with the ascending phase of capitalism. But in the 19th century, in the period of the flowering of nationalisms, far from being Zionist, the Jewish bourgeoisie was profoundly assimilationist. The economic process from which the modern nations issued laid the foundations for integration of the Jewish bourgeoisie into the bourgeois nation. It is only when the process of the formation of nations approaches its end, when the productive forces have for a long time found themselves constricted within national boundaries, that the process of expulsion of Jews from capitalist society begins to manifest itself, that modern anti-Semitism begins to develop. The expulsion of Jews accompanies the decline of capitalism. Far from being a product of the development of the productive forces, Zionism is precisely the consequence of the complete halt of this development, the result of the petrification of capitalism. Whereas the national movement is the product of the ascending period of capitalism, Zionism is the product of the imperialist era. The Jewish tragedy of the 20th century is a direct consequence of the decline of capitalism. Therein lies the principal obstacle to the realization of Zionism. Capitalist decay, basis for the growth of Zionism, is also the cause of the impossibility of its realization. Obviously, that didn't really end up coming to pass. Slightly incorrect prediction there. The Jewish bourgeoisie is compelled to create a national state from scratch to assure itself of the objective framework for the development of its productive forces, precisely in the period when the conditions for such a development have long since disappeared. The conditions of the decline of capitalism, which have posed so sharply the Jewish question, make its solution equally impossible along the Zionist road. And there is nothing astonishing in that. An evil cannot be suppressed without destroying its causes. But Zionism wishes to resolve the Jewish question without destroying capitalism, which is the principal source of the suffering of the Jews. At the end of the 19th century, in the period when the Jewish question was just beginning to be posed in all its sharpness, 150,000 Jews each year left their countries of origin. Between 1880 and 1925, nearly 4 million Jews emigrated. Despite these enormous figures, the Jewish population of Eastern Europe rose from 6 to 8 million. Thus, even when capitalism was still developing, even when the countries across the ocean were still receiving immigrants, the Jewish question could not even begin to be resolved in the Zionist sense. Far from diminishing, the Jewish population had a bad habit of wanting to grow. In order to begin to resolve the Jewish question, that is to say, in order to begin really to transplant the Jewish masses, it would be necessary for the countries of immigration to absorb at least a little more than the natural growth of Jews in the diaspora. That is, at least 300,000 Jews per year. And if such a figure could not be reached before the First Imperialist War, when all the conditions were still favorable for emigration, when all developed countries, such as the United States, were permitting the mass entry of immigrants, then how can we think that it is possible in a period of continuous crisis of capitalism, in a period of almost incessant wars? Naturally, there are enough ships in the world to transport hundreds of thousands of Jews, even millions. But if all countries have closed their doors to immigrants, it is because there is an overproduction of labor power, just as there is an overproduction of commodities. Contrary to Malthus, who believed there would be too many people on the planet because there would be a scarcity of goods, It is precisely the abundance of goods that is the cause for the plethora of human beings. In a period when the world markets are saturated with goods, when unemployment has everywhere become a permanent fixture, by what miracle can a country, however great and rich it may be, leave aside the data for poor and small Palestine, develop its productive forces to the point of being able to welcome 300,000 immigrants each year? In reality, the prospects for Jewish emigration diminish at the same time that the need for it increases. The causes that promote emigration are the same as those that prevent it from happening. They all spring from the decline of capitalism. It is from this fundamental contradiction between the necessity for and the possibility of emigration that the political difficulties of Zionism flow. The period of development of the European nations was also the period of an intensive colonization in the countries across the ocean. It was at the beginning and middle of the 19th century, in the golden age of European nationalism, that North America was colonized. It was also in this period that South America and Australia began to be developed. Vast areas of the earth were practically without a master and lent themselves marvelously to the establishment of millions of European emigrants. In that period, for reasons that we have studied, the Jews gave almost no thought to emigrating. Today, the whole world is colonized, industrialized, and divided among the various imperialisms. Everywhere, Jewish immigrants come into collision at one and the same time with the nationalism of the natives and with the ruling imperialism. In Palestine, Jewish nationalism collides with an increasingly aggressive Arab nationalism. The development of Palestine by Jewish immigration tends to increase the intensity of this Arab nationalism. The economic development of the country results in the growth of the Arab population, its social differentiation, the growth of a national capitalism. To overcome Arab resistance, the Jews need English imperialism, but its support is as harmful as is Arab resistance. English imperialism views with a favorable eye a weak Jewish immigration. To constitute a counterweight to the Arab factor, but it is intensely hostile to the establishment of a big Jewish population in Palestine, to its industrial development, to the growth of its proletariat. It merely uses the Jews as a counterweight to the Arab threat, but does everything to raise difficulties for Jewish immigration. Thus, to the increasing difficulties flowing from Arab resistance, there is added the perfidious game of British imperialism. Finally, we must draw still one more conclusion from the fundamental premises that have been established. Because of its necessarily artificial character, because of the slim perspectives for a rapid and normal development of the Palestinian economy in our period, the task of Zionist colonization requires considerable capital. Zionism demands incessantly increasing sacrifices from the Jewish communities of the world. But so long as the situation of the Jews is more or less bearable in the diaspora, no Jewish class feels the necessity of making these sacrifices. To the extent that the Jewish masses feel the necessity of having a country, to the extent also that persecutions mount in intensity, so much the less are the Jewish masses able to contribute to Zionist construction. A strong Jewish people in the diaspora is necessary for a Palestinian reconstruction, states Rupin. But so long as the Jewish people are strong in the diaspora, they feel no need for Palestinian reconstruction. When they strongly do feel this necessity, the possibility for realizing it will no longer exist. It would be difficult today to ask European Jews who have a pressing need to emigrate to give aid for the rebuilding of Palestine. The day when they will be able to do it, it is a safe assumption that their enthusiasm for this task will have considerably cooled. A relative success for Zionism, along the lines of creating a Jewish majority in Palestine and even of forming a Jewish state, that is to say, a state placed under the complete domination of English or American imperialism, cannot naturally be excluded. This would in some ways be a return to the state of things that existed in Palestine before the destruction of Jerusalem, and from this point of view, there would be reparation of a 2,000-year-old injustice. But such a tiny, independent Jewish state in the midst of a worldwide diaspora would be only an apparent return to the state of things before the year 70. It would not even be the beginning of the solution to the Jewish question. The Jewish diaspora of the Roman era was, in effect, based on solid economic ground. The Jews played an important economic role in the world. The existence or absence of a Palestinian mother country had for the Jews of this period only a secondary importance. Today, it is not a question of giving the Jews a political or spiritual center, as Zionist leader Akkad Ha'am would have it. It is a question of saving Jews from the annihilation that threatens them in the diaspora. But in what way will the existence of a small Jewish state in Palestine change anything in the situation of the Polish or German Jews? Admitting even that all the Jews in the world were today Palestinian citizens, would the policy of Hitler have been any different? One must be stricken with an incurable juridical cretinism to believe that the creation of a small Jewish state in Palestine can change anything at all in the situation of the Jews throughout the world, especially in the present period. The situation after the eventual creation of a Jewish state in Palestine will resemble the state of things that existed in the Roman era, only in the fact that in both cases the existence of a small Jewish state in Palestine could in no way influence the situation of the Jews in the diaspora. In the Roman era, the economic and social position of Judaism in the diaspora was very strong, so that the disappearance of this Jewish state did not in any way compromise it. Today, the situation of the Jews in the world is very bad, so the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine cannot in any way restore it. In both cases, the situation of the Jews does not at all depend on the existence of a state in Palestine, but is a function of the general economic, social, and political situation. Even supposing that the Zionist dream is realized and the ancient injustice is undone, and we are still very far from that, the situation of Jews throughout the world will in no way be modified. The temple will perhaps be rebuilt, but the faithful will continue to suffer. The history of Zionism is the best illustration of the insurmountable difficulties that it encounters, difficulties resulting, in the last analysis, from the fundamental contradiction that tears it apart. The contradiction between the growing necessity of resolving the Jewish question and the growing impossibility of resolving it under the conditions of decaying capitalism. Immediately following the First Imperialist War, Jewish emigration to Palestine encountered no great obstacles in its path. Despite that, there were relatively few immigrants. The economic conditions of capitalist countries after the war made the need to emigrate less pressing. It was, moreover, because of this light emigration that the British government did not feel obliged to set up bars to the entry of Jews into Palestine. In the years 1924, 1925, 1926, the Polish bourgeoisie opened an economic offensive against the Jewish masses. These years were also the period of a major immigration into Palestine. But this massive immigration soon collided with insurmountable economic difficulties. The ebb was almost as great as was the flood tide. Up to 1933, the date of Hitler's arrival to power, there was not much immigration. After this date, tens of thousands of Jews began to arrive in Palestine. But this conjuncture was soon arrested by a storm of anti-Jewish demonstrations and massacres. The Arabs seriously feared becoming a minority in the country. The Arab feudal elements feared being submerged by this capitalist wave. British imperialism profited from this tension by piling up obstacles to the entry of the Jews, by working to deepen the gulf existing between the Jews and the Arabs, by proposing the partition of Palestine. To the Second Imperialist War, Zionism thus found itself in the grip of mounting difficulties. The Palestinian population lived in a state of permanent terror. Precisely when the situation of the Jews became ever more desperate, Zionism showed itself absolutely incapable of providing a remedy. Illegal Jewish immigrants were greeted with rifle fire by their British protectors. The Zionist illusion began to lose its attractiveness, even in the eyes of the less informed. In Poland, the last elections before the war revealed that the Jewish masses were turning completely away from Zionism. The Jewish masses began to understand that Zionism not only could not seriously improve their situation, but that it was furnishing weapons to the anti-Semites by its theories of the objective necessity of Jewish emigration. The imperialist war and the triumph of Hitlerism in Europe are an unprecedented disaster for Judaism. Jews are confronted with the threat of total extinction. What can Zionism do in the face of such a disaster? Is it not obvious that the Jewish question is very little dependent upon the future destiny of Tel Aviv, but very greatly upon the regime that will be set up tomorrow in Europe and in the world? The Zionists place great hope in a victory of Anglo-American imperialism. But is there a single reason for believing that the attitude of the Anglo-American imperialists will differ if they are victorious from their pre-war attitude? It is obvious that there is none. Even if Anglo-American imperialism creates some kind of abortive Jewish state, we have seen that the situation of world Jewry will hardly be affected. A great Jewish emigration into Palestine after this war will confront the same difficulties as previously. Under conditions of capitalist decay, it is impossible to transplant millions of Jews. Only a worldwide socialist planned economy would be capable of such a miracle. Naturally, this presupposes the proletarian revolution. But Zionism wishes precisely to resolve the Jewish question independently of the world revolution. By misconstruing the real sources of the Jewish question in our period, by lulling itself with infantile dreams and silly hopes, Zionism proves that it is an ideological excrescence and not a scientific doctrine. Yeah, okay. Well, that is chapter 7. Now we come to the final chapter, chapter 8, toward a solution of the Jewish question. It is incorrect to state that a solution for the Jewish question has been needed for 2,000 years. The very fact that in the course of this long period such a solution was not found best demonstrates that it was not necessary. Judaism was an indispensable factor in pre-capitalist society. It was an essential organism within it. That is what explains the 2,000-year existence of Jews in the diaspora. The Jew was as characteristic in feudal society as the lord and the serf. It was no accident that a foreign element played the role of capital in feudal society. Feudal society, as such, could not create a capitalist element. As soon as it was able to do so, precisely then it began to cease being feudal. Nor was it accidental that the Jew remained a foreigner in the midst of feudal society. The capital of pre-capitalist society existed outside of its economic system. From the moment that capital begins to emerge from the womb of this social system and takes the place of the borrowed organ, the Jew is eliminated and feudal society ceases to be feudal. It is modern capitalism that has posed the Jewish question. Not because the Jews today number close to 20 million people, the proportion of Jews to non-Jews has declined greatly since the Roman era, but because capitalism destroyed the historical basis for the existence of the Jewish people. Capitalism destroyed feudal society, and with it the function of the Jewish people class. History doomed this people class to disappearance, and thus the Jewish question arose. The Jewish question is the question of adapting the Jewish people to modern society, of liquidating the heritage bequeathed to humanity by feudalism. For centuries, Judaism was a social organism within which social and national elements were closely intermingled. The Jews are far from constituting a race. On the contrary, they are probably one of the most typical and conspicuous examples of racial mixture. This does not mean, however, that the Asiatic element is not very noticeable in the mixture, sufficiently outstanding, in any case, to set the Jew apart in the Western nations, where he is chiefly to be found. This real national base is supplemented by an imaginary poetic base, formed out of the age-old tradition that attaches the Jew of today to his distant ancestors of biblical times. The class base and psychology of the merchant were subsequently grafted onto this national foundation. The national and social elements became mixed to the point of complete intermingling. It would be difficult to distinguish in a Polish Jew the part that his type has inherited from his ancestors and the part acquired from the social function that he fulfilled in that country for centuries. It must be agreed that the social base long ago acquired greater importance than the national base. At any rate, if the social element came to be added to the national element, the latter could persist only thanks to the former. It is thanks to his social and economic situation that the Jew was able to preserve himself. Capitalism has posed the Jewish question. That is to say, it has destroyed the social foundations on which Judaism maintained itself for centuries. But capitalism has not resolved the Jewish question, for it has been unable to absorb the Jew liberated from his social shell. The decline of capitalism has suspended the Jews between heaven and earth. The Jewish pre-capitalist merchant has largely disappeared, but his son has found no place in modern production. The social basis of Judaism has crumbled. Jews have become largely a declassed element. Capitalism has not only doomed the social function of the Jews, it has also doomed the Jews themselves. Petty bourgeois ideologists are always inclined to raise a historical phenomenon into an eternal category. For them, the Jewish question is a function of the diaspora. Only the concentration of the Jews in Palestine can resolve it. But it is pure childishness to reduce the Jewish question to a question of territory. The territorial solution has meaning only if it signifies the disappearance of traditional Judaism, the penetration of Jews into modern economy, the productivization of the Jews. By a detour, Zionism thus returns to the solution proposed by its worst enemies, the consistent assimilationists. For the Zionists, as well as for the assimilationists, it is a question of doing away with the cursed heritage of the past, of making workers, farmers, productive intellectuals of the Jews. The illusion of Zionism does not consist in its desire to attain this result. That is a historical necessity that will cut its own path sooner or later. Its illusion consists in believing that the insurmountable difficulties that decaying capitalism puts in the way of these tasks will disappear as if by magic in Palestine. But if the Jews were unable to find a place in economic life in the diaspora, the same causes will prevent them from doing so in Palestine. The world today is so much a unit that it is sheer folly to try to build within it a haven sheltered from its storms. That is why the failure of assimilation must of necessity be followed by the failure of Zionism. In this period when the Jewish question takes on the aspect of a terrible tragedy, Palestine can be no more than a feeble palliative. 10 million Jews find themselves in a huge concentration camp. What remedy can the creation of a few Zionist colonies bring to this question? Well then, neither assimilation nor Zionism? No solution at all? No. There is no solution to the Jewish question under capitalism, just as there is no solution to the other problems posed before humanity, without profound social upheavals. The same causes that make the emancipation of the Jews an illusion also make the realization of Zionism impossible. Unless the deep causes for the Jewish question are eliminated, the effects cannot be eliminated. The ghetto and the wheel, the badge imposed on Jews in the Middle Ages, have reappeared. Symbols, moreover, of the tragic destiny toward which humanity is being driven. But the very exacerbation of anti-Semitism prepares the road for its disappearance. The driving out of the Jews provides momentarily a kind of living space for the petty bourgeoisie. Aryanization creates jobs for some tens of thousands of unemployed intellectuals and petty bourgeois. But in attacking the apparent causes of their misfortunes, the petty bourgeoisie has merely strengthened the operation of the real causes. Fascism will accelerate the process of proletarianization of the middle classes. After the Jewish petty bourgeoisie, hundreds of thousands of other shopkeepers and artisans were expropriated and proletarianized. Capitalist concentration made gigantic progress. Improvement in the economic situation took place only at the price of preparation for the Second Imperialist War, the cause of enormous destruction and slaughter. Thus, the tragic fate of the Jewish people mirrors with singular sharpness the situation of all humanity. The decline of capitalism means for the Jews the return to the ghetto, although the basis for the ghetto disappeared long ago, along with the foundations of feudal society. Similarly, for all humanity, capitalism bars the road of the past as well as the highway to the future. Only the destruction of capitalism will make it possible for humanity to benefit from the immense achievements of the industrial era. Is it astonishing that the Jewish masses, who are the first to feel, and with special sharpness, the effects of the contradictions of capitalism, should have furnished rich forces for the socialist and revolutionary struggle? On various occasions, Lenin emphasized the importance of the Jews for the revolution, not only in Russia, but in other countries as well. Lenin also expressed the thought that the flight of a of a part of the Jewish population into the interior of Russia as a result of the occupation during World War I of the industrial regions of the West had been a very useful thing for the revolution, just as the appearance of a large number of Jewish intellectuals in the Russian cities during the war had also been useful. They helped the Bolsheviks smash the widespread and extremely dangerous sabotage that confronted them everywhere immediately following the revolution. Thus, they helped the revolution to survive a very critical stage. The high percentage of Jews in the proletarian movement is only a reflection of the tragic situation of the Jewish people in our time. The intellectual faculties of the Jews, fruit of the historic past of Judaism, are thus an important support for the proletarian movement. In this latter fact lies a final, and not the least important, reason for modern anti-Semitism. The ruling classes persecute with special sadism the Jewish intellectuals and workers, who have supplied a host of fighters to the revolutionary movement. To isolate the Jews completely from the sources of culture and science has become a vital necessity for the decaying system that persecutes them. The ridiculous legend of Jewish Marxism is nothing but a caricature of the bonds that actually exist between socialism and the Jewish masses. Never has the situation of the Jews been so tragic. In the worst periods of the Middle Ages, entire countries opened their doors to receive them. Today, capitalism, which rules the whole world, makes the earth uninhabitable for them. Never has the mirage of a promised land so haunted the Jewish masses, but never was a promised land less capable of resolving the Jewish question than in our time. The very paroxysm, however, that the Jewish question has reached today also provides the key to its solution. The plight of the Jews has never been so tragic, but never has it been so close to ceasing to be that. In past centuries, hatred of the Jews had a real basis in the social antagonism that set them against other classes of the population. Today, the interests of the Jewish classes are closely bound up with the interests of the popular masses of the entire world. By persecuting the Jews as capitalist, capitalism makes them complete pariahs. The ferocious persecutions against Jews render stark naked the stupid bestiality of anti-Semitism and destroy the remnants of prejudices that the working classes nurse against the Jews. The ghettos and the yellow badges do not prevent the workers from feeling a growing solidarity with those who suffer most from the afflictions all humanity is suffering. And the greatest social explosion the world will ever have seen is finally preparing the liberation of the most persecuted pariahs of our planet. When the people of the factories and the fields have finally thrown off the yoke of the capitalists, when a future of unlimited development opens up before liberated humanity, the Jewish masses will be able to make a far from unimportant contribution toward the building of a new world. This does not mean that socialism, by the wave of a magic wand, will remove all the difficulties that stand as obstacles to the solution of the Jewish question. The example of the Soviet Union shows that even after the proletarian revolution, the special structure of Jewry, a heritage of history, will give rise to a number of difficulties, particularly during the transition periods. During the time of the new economic policy, for instance, the Jews of Russia, utilizing their traditional business experience, furnished numerous cadres for the new bourgeois class. Moreover, the great mass of Jewish small tradesmen and petty artisans suffered greatly at the beginning of the proletarian dictatorship. It was only later, with the success of the 5-year plan that the Jews became massively integrated into Soviet economic life. Despite certain difficulties, the experiment was decisive. Hundreds of thousands of Jews became workers and peasants. The fact that white-collar workers and functionaries constitute a considerable percentage of wage-earning Jews must not be considered a matter for concern. Socialism has no interest per se in all Jews taking up manual occupations. On the contrary, the intellectual faculties of the Jews should be put to widest use. It is thus clear that, even under the relatively difficult conditions of a backward country, the proletariat can solve the Jewish question. The Jews have massively entered the Russian economy. The productivization of the Jews has been accompanied by two parallel processes: assimilation and territorial concentration. Wherever the Jews go into industry, they are rapidly assimilated. As early as 1926, there were hardly 40% of the Jewish miners in the Donetsk basin who spoke Yiddish. Nevertheless, the Jews live under a regime of national autonomy. They have special schools, a Yiddish press, autonomous courts. But the Jewish nationalists are continually deploring the abandonment of these schools and this press. Only in those places where fairly dense masses of Jews have been colonized, especially in Birobidzhan, do we witness a kind of national renaissance. Thus, life itself demonstrates that the question that so bitterly divides the Jews, assimilation or territorial concentration, is a fundamental question only to petty bourgeois dreamers. The Jewish masses want simply an end to their martyrdom. That socialism alone can give them. But socialism must give the Jews, as it will to all peoples, the possibility of assimilation, as well as the possibility of having a special national life. The end of Judaism? Certainly. Despite their apparently irreconcilable opposition, assimilationists and nationalists are agreed in combating Judaism as history has known it, the mercantile Judaism of the diaspora, the people class. The Zionists never stop repeating that it is a matter of creating a new type of Jew in Palestine, altogether different from the Jew of the diaspora. They even reject with horror the language and culture of the Jews of the diaspora. In Birobidzhan, in the Ukraine and the Donetsk basin, even the old man discards his traditional dress. The people class, historical Judaism, has been definitely doomed by history. Despite all its traditional pretensions, Zionism will not culminate in a national renaissance, but at the most, in a national birth. The new Jew resembles neither his brother of the diaspora nor his ancestor of the era of the fall of Jerusalem. The young Palestinian, proud of speaking the language of Bar Kokhba, would probably not be understood by his ancestor. In reality, the Jews in the Roman era spoke Aramaic and Greek fluently, but had only a vague knowledge of Hebrew. Moreover, Neo-Hebrew, in the nature of things, is going further and further away from the language of the Bible. Everything will add up to estrange the Jew of Palestine from the Judaism of the diaspora. And tomorrow, when national barriers and prejudices begin to disappear in Palestine, who can doubt that a fruitful reconciliation will take place between the Arab and the Jewish workers, the result of which will be their partial or total fusion? Eternal Judaism, which, moreover, has never been anything but a myth, will disappear. It is childish to pose assimilation and the national solution as opposites, even in those countries where Jewish national communities will eventually be created. We will be witnessing either the creation of a new Jewish nationality, completely different from the old, or the formation of new nations. Moreover, even in the first case, unless the people already established in the country are driven out or the rigorous prescriptions of Ezra and Nehemiah are revived, this new nationality cannot fail to come under the influence of the long-time inhabitants of the country. In the sphere of nationality, only socialism can bring the widest democracy. It must provide the Jews with the opportunity of having a national life in every country they inhabit. It must also give them the opportunity of concentrating in one or more territories, naturally without injuring the interests of the native inhabitants. Naturally without injuring the interests of the native inhabitants. Only the widest proletarian democracy will make possible the resolution of the Jewish question with a minimum of suffering. In other words, it seems like he's calling the Zionism that did actually arise a perverted mess. Makes sense. Clearly, the tempo of the solution of the Jewish question depends upon the general tempo of socialist construction. The opposition between assimilation and the national solution is an entirely relative one, the latter often being nothing but the prelude to the former. Historically, all existing nations are the products of various fusions of races and peoples. It is not excluded that new nations, fanned by the fusion, or even the dispersion of nations now existing, will be created. However it may be, socialism must limit itself in this sphere to letting nature take its course. Thus, in a certain sense, socialism will return to the practice of pre-capitalist society. It was capitalism, by virtue of the fact that it provided an economic basis for the national question, that also created intractable national antagonisms. Before the capitalist era, Slovaks, Czechs, Germans, French lived in perfect harmony. Wars did not have a national character. They had interest only for the possessing classes. The policy of compulsory assimilation, of national persecution, was unknown to the Romans. Submission of barbarian peoples to Romanization or Hellenization was a peaceful process. Today, national, cultural, and linguistic antagonisms are only manifestations of the economic antagonism created by capitalism. With the disappearance of capitalism, the national question will lose all its acuteness. If it is premature to speak of a worldwide assimilation of peoples, it is nonetheless clear that a planned economy on a global scale will bring all the peoples of the world much closer to each other. But the hastening of this assimilation by artificial means would hardly seem to be indicated. Nothing could do more harm. We still cannot foresee exactly what the offspring of present Judaism will be. Socialism will take care that the birth take place under the best possible conditions. And that's it. That's it. It's done. So we will go back in the bookshelf later. Now, I I will be back in a moment. Now, so having now finished that book, it is very clear that the Jewish question has not been solved yet. It has not been solved. In fact, it has very much evolved into what I term the Zionist problem. Now, why do I call it a problem as opposed to a question? Because what the Zionist problem has done, in effect, is distort the Jewish question in a way that has exacerbated imperialism to such an extent that terrible way of putting it, but if you wait a moment, I will explain why it's not what it sounds like. Zionism created the demon that Hitler feared. Now, I am not a Nazi. Obviously, I am not an ethnic anti Semite or a racial anti Semite. I believe that there is a bit of a problem with meshing those two terms of race and ethnicity. And ethnicity is not something that is static and genetic, it is something that is cultural, whereas race is like genetic. That's the way I consider it anyway. It's more helpful. So, what exactly do I mean by that? So, let's really try to unpack that a bit. And I think it is pretty simple for starters to look to the lobbies. Now, I think it is not unrealistic to say that the lobbies, in a sense, have control of governments. However, what should not be stated, what should not be taken as a conclusion from that is that the Jews have control of the government. So these days, when I use the term Zionism, I am distinguishing between Zionism and Judaism. The Zionism is less an ideology of Jews, even if the majority of Jews support it. That is starting to change. Zionism in effect, or modern Zionism, I should say. Modern Zionism is simply the modern character of capitalist imperialism. And there is a sense in which religious eschatology also plays into things here. There is a way in which, a very obvious way, if you really think about it, in which the religious eschatology of the three major Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are all playing a role in this ascendant new form of imperialism. Now, I may be making the exact same mistake that Karl Kautsky made, which perhaps I should self-criticize a little bit on that. This is a framework in progress. Like, I may be making the same mistake with one notion here that Karl Kautsky made with his notion of what was it, ultra imperialism or something like that. Um, and that's basically like the notion of like capitalism culminating in like a union of national trusts or something into like a kind of thing. And a lot of that is something to be debated and self-criticized a little bit. So I probably do need to look into that as I keep going. This is just a framework I've got in development. So the hypothesis, which I'm basically calling geopolitical eschatology. It is an attempt that I am making to basically try and explain the dialectical relationship between Abrahamic eschatology or between particular interpretations of Abrahamic eschatology of all three major religions and modern geopolitics. And central to this is basically the premise that the previous economic base of imperialism, of Anglo-American imperialism, which created the state of Israel as an extension of itself, has also created an ideological superstructure which is based on Abrahamic eschatology. And that said Abrahamic eschatology, or said ideology based on it, I shouldn't say the eschatology itself, but this version of this ideological eschatology, this part of the superstructure, has in dialectical fashion imposed itself onto the base in a way that is leading to a self-fulfillment of the particular interpretation of Abrahamic eschatology in a materialist and geopolitical form, and one which is turning out to be extremely dangerous. So, what are the three general interpretations that I am thinking about here? So, for Judaism, for the Jewish side of the Jewish part of that sort of triumvirate, religious Zionism, the ideology that is effectively undergirding the Greater Israel Project. This and other things like the Temple Institute. Basically, this idea that the state of Israel needs to expand its borders to the biblical borders of Israel. These are the borders that are in the thumbnail there. So going all the way from the Nile to the Euphrates. Yeah. So very, very big expanse of land. All of Jordan, all of Lebanon, all of historic Palestine, like a massive chunk out of Saudi Arabia, a massive chunk out of Iraq and Syria, like the Sinai Peninsula. Yeah, like a very big swath of land. Like it's going to be like at least 15 times the size of like current sort of Israel-Palestine. But that and the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem will lead to the Jewish Messiah. Or in this case, I would say the Zionist Messiah, not so much the Jewish Messiah. Because I would say that there is a bit of a distinction to be made between the two, given that the Zionist Messiah would very much be kind of like a Jewish Hitler. As ironic as that sounds, it would very much be like a Jewish Hitler, like a dictator who is particularly murderous. So, because this would be emerging from like a far right Jewish fascism. So that is like the Jewish element. The Christian element, I'm not exactly 100% certain of at this point in time. However, it is in curious alignment with Christian Zionism. So it is essentially like Christian Zionism, but a bit different. And really, to understand this kind of the Christian part of that, we have to also understand the Islamic part of that, which they're pretty much identical. Like a common theme here that will be these three interpretations, they basically align. And the Islamic interpretation in question is that of Sheikh Imran Hussein. Basically, this idea of like a threefold empire theory leading up to the emergence of the Antichrist. Now, the Antichrist is in both Christian and in both the Christian and Islamic eschatology at play here. The Antichrist is the Jewish Messiah, or in this case, the Zionist Messiah, a false Messiah. Obviously, in Islam, it's called like the Dajjal or something, but basically Antichrist. Now, Imran Hussein's idea is basically that there is a threefold evolution of empires. There's like Pax Britannica, so the British Empire, which created the state of Israel, and Pax Americana, so the American Empire, or as I call it, the Anglo-American Empire, because there is some continuity there, as will be established in the imperialism unit as we go through that. That has basically facilitated the rise, the ascendancy of the state of Israel, to the point where it is trying to basically to facilitate greater Israel and all this stuff that will fulfill these prophecies. Let me just. So um, so yeah, and the basically after a great war, like a World War III, if you will, the Pax Americana will give way to Pax Judaica. Basically like a global Zionist empire. And that is when the Antichrist will come. Now, that's a very interesting hypothesis, especially considering that we seem to be heading for a World War III. Now, I would have to reconsult the book of Revelation. As I said, this is all a framework in development. Um, but my suspicion is that basically the interpretation of Christian eschatology that would basically fit this framework is one where if we go for like the major elements of the end times prophecy, Babylon would be this Pax Judaica. That would pretty much be what it is. The Antichrist would be the future Zionist Messiah. The false prophet, which is sort of where it gets it into this stuff here. The false prophet would be the Silicon Valley tech oligarchy. And that is because the mark of the beast would be the global surveillance state that is currently being created. Now, global surveillance state does not mean in the sense of a literal one world government, but in the sense of these tech corporations basically like gaining a monopoly on all of the surveillance, like having all of this surveillance, basically spying on everybody, getting all their data, selling all their data, trying to control these social media algorithms to control what people can think. Eventually, controlling money and stuff. If there is one thing that I have noticed, there's one thing that has become very, very apparent to me. That, at least to some degree, when people on the right talk about stuff like digital ID, when they talk about stuff like central bank digital currencies, and all of this sort of stuff, when they talk about stuff like Neuralink, if we're going to get a little bit more into the speculative territory, there is a massive, glaring modicum of truth to it all. For a very long time, the left was basically like, no, it's all just a conspiracy theory. Kind of. The modicum of truth exists. It is being taken in the wrong direction. Well, it's been taken to the wrong conclusions. It is not that it is not that the essence of this stuff about more surveillance and more like, the CBDC, the digital ID, all of this kind of stuff. It is literally being laid out right before our eyes. The universal basic income, the automation of labor. It is like with AI and stuff. It is all being done right in front of us. So to try and deny all of that is to ultimately cede ground to fascists who will capitalize on that, who will fearmonger on that, to blame scapegoats like globalists for it. And again, this globalism, I said that before while I was reading. This globalism is just trying to detach capitalism and imperialism from each other. It is trying to detach the two. They are inseparable. They are inseparable. They cannot be broken apart. And it basically goes into all of this where, yes, this global surveillance state, global per se, is being created in the sense where these tech billionaires are rolling out these softwares for age verification, for spying, for constant surveillance, for digital currencies, like all of this kind of stuff. I've seen WorldCoin brought up in a video. The WorldCoin being, was it Sam Altman who started that? All of this kind of stuff. These ideologies that are floating around in Silicon Valley. All of this is, in effect, a mark of the beast. It is, in effect, mark of the beast. That is what it is. a global surveillance state, global not in the sense of an actual global state, but in the sense of these corporations, this oligarchy, having basically global control. And what can be noticed when we really look at it, when we dig into it, all of these oligarchs are pro-Israel. All of these oligarchs are right in that Zionist thing, which is why I refer to a Zionist oligarchy. Technically, I should be referring to it as an imperialist oligarchy, but a Zionist oligarchy. It illustrates the point that is being created here, that the future of world imperialism, the future of world imperialism is inseparable from the Zionist problem. That is the essence of the Zionist problem. It is, or it's inseparable from the Jewish question. The future of world imperialism is inseparable from the Jewish question. It is inseparable from the state of Israel. And it is also inseparable from Abrahamic eschatology. It is all, like, as I said, this economic base, this economic base of capitalist imperialism created the state of Israel, Pax Britannica, and continued its ascendancy, Pax Americana, has created this eschatological ideology, this superstructure that is now imposing itself on the base, Pax Judaica, creating, like, basically forcing eschatological prophecies to come to pass in an imperialist form, or in a materialist form. Sorry, in a materialist form. When I say materialist form, why do I say that? Because I don't think Jesus is coming back. That's why I say in a materialist form, because I don't think Jesus is coming back. No matter how much Christians or Muslims may have a problem with that, I don't think Jesus is coming back. I'm not going to rest. I'm not going to rest on my laurels, laying out in, like, most likely misplaced faith that some dude who died 2,000 years ago, I know the Muslims don't think he actually died, but who died, who was crucified 2,000 years ago for trying to overthrow the Romans, I am not going to rest on my laurels with complacent faith that some dude who was executed 2,000 years ago for wanting to overthrow the Romans to come back and save us. I think that is complacent. Look, believe it all you want. I don't care. But don't let it be a motivator of complacency. That is my main issue. If you act anyway, we're good. But if you treat that religious belief, that conviction, as a reason, as a motivator for complacency, all you are doing is proving Marx's point that religion is the opiate of the masses, that it is nothing more than a pacification device, that it is nothing more than a way for the ruling class, for the imperialist class, for the Zionist oligarchy to keep you pacified, to keep you from acting. Whether you believe it or not, I don't care. But if you use it for complacency, you are part of the problem. I thought I'd make that clear. Now, so if this Pax Judaica is like a next stage of imperialism, what is the solution? Well, if this eschatological superstructure has been imposed on the economic base and is forcing these biblical prophecies to come to pass in a materialist form, what is the solution? Simple. A materialist equivalent of the second coming. What is that materialist equivalent of the second coming? The world proletarian revolution. which, again, will resolve the Zionist problem, will resolve the Jewish question, will resolve many of these problems, because you have destroyed the basis from which you have destroyed the base from which all of this crap has arisen in the first place. It is really that simple. You have a materialist Perusia, a materialist second coming, and then you have a materialist kingdom of God, communism. It's really that simple. So now, am I saying, oh, because we should think about this eschatologically, should we see this as like inevitable? No, obviously not. In fact, I think we are running out of time, because I have a suspicion that if Pax Judaica is fully realized, this full automation of labor, this full automation, like this, this fully encompassing surveillance state with all of this stuff, and the full automation of labor using AI. Once that happens, the proletariat loses the basis of its struggle, by which it can organize its class struggle. What power does the working class have if it can't go on a strike because it isn't needed anymore? It is destroying the basis of the proletariat. It is destroying the material social basis of the proletariat. And in doing so, all it is setting up is the eternal victory of the bourgeoisie. And call that defeatist. But I do think that we are running out of time. How much time we have, I have no idea. It is looking like we may be bought time by the fact that these, like, transformer large language models might be a bit of a dead end. But that is not going to stop them from continuing to try. And they may succeed. Do I think this is going to constitute like a one world government in the sense that like right wingers fear? No. Nation states will still exist. It is, and really, like, some people talk about like, oh, loss of national sovereignty. It's like nations already don't really have any sovereignty. Like Australia, for instance. People say, oh, we lost our national sovereignty. We never had sovereignty in the first place. We're a puppet of Britain first, and then now we're a puppet of America. All that'll change with Pax Judaica is that we'll be a puppet of Israel. Like, that's all that will change. It's just bouncing from empire to empire, remaining a sub-imperial power. And that'll be well referenced. Once I've gotten through this, when I go through this, nothing will change. Nothing will fundamentally change without a proletarian revolution. Without that, nothing changes. We don't gain any sovereignty at all whatsoever. None. And before you go, oh, tanky, I'm not a tanky. I'm not a Marxist-Leninist. I'm an actual communist. Because if Professor Jiang is to be taken at his word, China is caught up in this shit too. The supposed king of the socialist world right now is caught up in this crap. Is caught up in this crap because of some Ben Gurion canal plan that Israel has that's going to allow more trade. In other words, so China is getting is compromised as well. The supposed socialist paradise of China would also be caught up in this crap, would also be compromised. That's not communism. That's just more of the same crap. And Imran Hussein, he's spoken about Israel's goal basically being to plunge the superpowers into war so they can kill each other, so they can destroy each other, so that it can ascend and take their place. Now, how true is that going to be? Time will tell. but it's a possibility that has to be taken into consideration, in my view. Now, to address the elephant in the room, do I believe all Jews are to blame for this? No, of course not. That would be stupid. Do I think Judaism is to blame for this? I'm just going to say it? Yes. Yes. I do think that Judaism is to blame for this. However, I also think that Christianity and Islam also are to blame for this. This is not just the fault of the Jews. This is the fault of all the Abrahamic faiths, equally. So no, I'm not singling out Judaism. All three of them have created this mess that we are currently living in, where all of these violent prophecies, or particular interpretations of these violent prophecies, are being imposed onto the economic base in a way that, if we're not fucking careful, will end in nuclear war. And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand about this. This shit's dangerous because this could result in a nuclear war. Has anyone, look at the Samson option. They've talked about nuking the entire world if they get destroyed. Israel. About nuking the entire world. Sure, maybe, the Israeli Liberal Party or whatever their Liberal Party is called there, the centre-left party, maybe the Liberal or the Labour Zionists won't do it. Maybe Likud won't even do it. But do you think that messianic religious fanatics won't do it? When they have power? Do you think that a Pax Judaica that has messianic theocrats at the helm, that has tried to create, has a Zionist Messiah with nothing to lose and everything to gain according to some religious fanaticism, do you think they won't nuke the world? That's the problem. It is not just Judaism that has caused this. It is Christianity and Islam as well. Does that mean I believe, religion should be destroyed? Does it mean I'm an anti-theist? Kinda. Not really. Not in the sense that I think religion should be destroyed, but in the fact that I think religion should be defanged wherever possible. That the power of religious narratives like this is causing this kind of violent problem. And yes, I'm wearing a cross on my chest. Whoop-de-doo. Because I believe in the morality of Jesus to a great extent. That doesn't mean I think he rose from the dead. That doesn't mean I think he's going to come back and save us from this shit. I'm not complacent like that. So that's really all I wanted to get into with kind of digging into the weeds here. But this all had to be said. And, I'll probably write Substack articles on this in the future. I'm sure I will write Substack articles on this shit eventually. Maybe an entire book at some point. Who knows? I will need to revisit Revelation. It'll be good for me to read the Quran. All of this kind of stuff. I will look into this. But, it needs to be understood what's going on. And we need to have clarity if we are to overcome it. If we are to overcome the capitalist system, if we are to overcome imperialism, if we are to overcome the possible dystopia that is being hailed in, we must have clarity about the material basis of the material basis behind it and how that can be overcome, which is through communism. We should not be parading around with extravagant conspiracy theories about what do most of these conspiracy theories come down to? The exact same kind of eschatology that has created this mess in the first place. You want to look at the conspiracy theory version, It's the version where everything I just explained with regards to Christian eschatology in the West is taken literally. That's the conspiracy version, where it's all taken literally, where it's like, oh, literally, like literal mark of the beast and literal antichrist, whoever it might be. That's the problem. That's the problem. This eschatology that is being forced onto reality, that is being forced onto the base, and is creating the problem in the first place. It is a violent and vicious self-fulfilling prophecy. But that's about all I really had to say. So yeah, that's really all I had to say. Obviously, the streams next week. Next week uh, the you know continue reading this on Tuesday. I'll start playing Freedom Planet 2 on Thursday. And next Saturday I'll begin reading Ilan Pape's A Very Short History of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, so to further become acquainted with the history of Israel and Palestine and how that relates to the problems today. But yeah, very important things that we need to keep our eyes on, that we need to make sure that we understand, so that we can overcome them. So it is really as simple as that. But yeah, that's really all she wrote. So I'll see you guys next time.